Hello, I'm Bernard O'Donoghue. I'm an ex-English tutor from Wadham who retired 10 years ago. I'm a medievalist, but I taught 20th century poetry, including C. DayLewis. This is the 50th anniversary of the death of DayLewis. And in 2004, the centenary of his birth, the DayLewis room in Modern College was named for him. And the portraits of DayLewis that were put up there by Robert Buehler are still there. One of them we have here today. It's DayLewis from the 1950s. He came to Wadham as a classics undergraduate in the 1920s. He was taught by Maurice Bowra, and they became close friends. While he was a student, he was an active member of the Poetry Society that centred on W.H. Auden. And they were a group of left-wing committed young poets. They were called the Max Bondi Group, which was a term that was devised for them by a kind of hostile observer. And they were MacNeice, Splendor, Auden, and DayLewis. That's how the Max Bondi was made up. But they were treated as if they were a single group. And in this picture here, we have three of them. There are no pictures with the four of them together, which is sort of significant in a way because they didn't belong together quite to that degree. Here we have Auden, DayLewis, and Splendor. It's quite interesting looking at them all on Wikipedia, for instance. Auden is described as an American poet. DayLewis is described as a British poet who was born in Ireland. MacNeice is described as an Irish poet who lived in England. And Splendor is just described as an English poet. So they're all given a slightly different kind of characterization. But in the 1930s, they were the 30s poets. You know, they were the leading figures in British poetry. And here we have several things linked to that. The book The Buried Day is DayLewis's autobiography, I suppose memoir really. It was written in 1940 when he was only 36, and he didn't write any further autobiography. There are strange connections between DayLewis and Louis MacNeice, who was the first element of Max Bondi, so to speak. They were both the sons of Irish or Church of Ireland, Church of England clergymen. The mothers of both of them died when they were aged 4 or 5, and left a very kind of striking mark on them. And they both came to school in England, but the question of their relationship to Ireland remained, you know, an interesting and sort of significant one. The last connection in a way is that MacNeice also wrote an incomplete memoir in the same way, a famous book called The Strings Are False, which is a major book. But he also didn't go past 1940, as if some part of their lives was sort of finished by then. One of the interesting things about DayLewis, for me anyway, because I'm Irish, I come from County Cork, but he grew up, he was born in County Laois in Ireland, but he went back for holidays to Wexford, where his father was a clergyman. And in this poem called Fishguard to Rosslare, he talks in an almost sort of prophetic way about the experience of going to getting on the boat in Fishguard, spending overnight and arriving in Wexford the next morning. It's a very interesting version of this kind of toing and froing for kind of holiday periods, which is very typical of the English Irish experience in that way. There's another picture of Auden and DayLewis. with Christopher Isherwood in the middle, from the same sort of period, in 1937. So again, we haven't got MacNeice in the picture. This item is a staircase party, a dinner party, in DayLewis's student time in the 1920s. And you can see how very different it is from current staircase parties, all dicky bows and waiters, really. The next stage that this brings us on to is DayLewis married and had 2 children with the daughter of a teacher at Sherborne, where he was teaching as well. That marriage broke up after about 20 years, and he married Jill Balkan in the 1950s. And here there's a copy of Stephen Spender's book, World Within World, which is an autobiography, a complete autobiography, again written relatively early, but comes to the end of its material, really. And there's a nice copy of World Within World, that is the Spender autobiography, given by Jill Balkan to Cecil DayLewis, for my beloved Cecil, on his birthday and our wedding day, 27/4/1951. And of course, the name lives on, of course, because their second child was Daniel DayLewis, the actor. But here, the Magnetic Mountain is a long allegorical poem written by DayLewis in the 30s, which was a rather extraordinary, long and not the kind of poetry that was much being written in the 30s. And the politics of the 4 of them remains interesting, and they kind of broke off from the left-wing general group at different sort of paces, really. MacNeice first, really. MacNeice in the 40s. They're all kind of, good liberals and all that, but MacNeice broke away from active politics altogether. Auden, of course, rather turned against it and went back to religion from the 1950s onwards, and stopped being so radical. DayLewis remained strikingly on the left until the 1960s, when he finally kind of broke the interest with the Communist Party, which he'd been a member of for a long time. The other important thing, of course, which divides them, is the experience in World War II, when Auden went to America. And of course, Auden is described as an American poet on Wikipedia, and wasn't forgiven for it. He emigrated to America in 1939, and he was fairly non grata, really, for the rest of his life in England, though greatly admired as a major poet, because he is unquestionably the greatest poet of the 4 of them. But he died in Vienna in 1973. But he'd just come back to live in Oxford during the academic year, but didn't live long. But the most active, DayLewis was the most active of the group in the war, and he wrote this great poem, which is often quoted as a little poem called "Where Are the War Poets?" And of course, the expression itself, "Where are the war poets?" is a major question. And this ends, "It is the logic of our times, no subject for immortal verse, that we who lived by honest dreams defend the bad against the worse." And that's the line that has caught on most from DayLewis, defending the bad against the worse. He still thinks that the injustice of the political structure in England, Britain, is bad. but there is worse, which they're aware of through the 1940s. He is a good, infrequent public poet, DayLewis, in poems like that. And the next poem in this group is called A Failure, and it's a very good poem on the subject of writer's block, really, which again he was very good on. But he says that, when you've been trying to write something and kind of forcing the issue all the time, it's useless to argue the why and wherefore, and a crop is so thin. There's nothing to do but to set the teeth and plough it in, which is another of the phrases of his that's kind of caught on. DayLewis was a director of Chatto&Windus, so he was actively involved with the London publishing world for a long time, until pretty well until his death, really. He died in 1972, but in the late 1960s. And several of these books here are things published by Chatto in DayLewis's time. Canon Charles Kingsley, a biography by Una Pope Hennessy, for instance, but there are several others as well. Several of these books are from DayLewis's own library, which are held in the Wadham library. Like this biography of Max Barebone by David Cecil, who was also an English fellow of Wadham in the 1930s. But it's interesting seeing the range of his interests. This book in his library called London's Underworlds, edited by Peter Quannell. He remained interested in the underworld, so to speak, in issues of sort of social justice all through his life, both as publisher and as writer. I suppose the other strength of DayLewis, that is the poem that everybody knows, and the line that everybody knows, is about leaving his son, his eldest son, when he's 5, at the school gate, and turning on his heel to go home. And he describes it as, he says, love is shown in the letting go, which is a phrase that has kind of caught on, which echoes with a lot of people. So there are various familiar kind of modes of DayLewis's. A couple of poems here, which we'll talk about later on. A poem called A Hard Frost. He's a good descriptive poet, just describing the natural world and the various aspects of it. There's Children Leaving Home is one of his last poems, actually, but it's about really feeling guilty towards children as you get older, and again, sort of letting go, but also learning patience and so on. The other major thing of DayLewis is that I haven't mentioned yet is he's a very major translator, especially of Virgil. I mean, some of the best translations of the Aeneid and the bucolics in particular, the standard work, the Penguin editions are DayLewis. And he is a marvellous translator into verse. He's got a very good ear. I mean, he's and here's the Aeneid of Virgil. He sent this copy of the Aeneid to Maurice Bowra, who was the warden of Wadham as well as his tutor. And it's interesting tracing the relationship and the friendship between them. One of the letters over there is, it begins, Dear Dean and ex-tutor, which was just after he'd left, just after he finished his classics degree. But the jokey sort of tone is it's kind of caught in that. And Bowra replies, My dear Cecil, which is a kind of friendly address for a tutor in the 1920s. DayLewis sends the Aeneid to Bowra. Dear Maurice, I thought you'd like to have a copy of my Aeneid translation, and I hope it will give you pleasure. Yours, Cecil. it's typed and relatively formal. So that's 1960s, when he is established as a kind of translating figure. He's no less friendly towards Barebone, it's just that there's kind of more confidence to it. The Snowfall in College Garden is the Wadham garden. A very eloquent poem about snow on branches and falling with a thump on the ground. As well as a poet and translator, he was, of course, a very major success in various academic, literary ways. I mean, he was the poet laureate after John Masefield was poet laureate for 50 years. DayLewis succeeded him, only briefly because he died after 4 years in the job, and was succeeded by his great friend Max Barebone, by John Betjeman. And here we've got, in his books, there's Betjeman's perhaps best known poem, A Subaltern's Love Song, Miss Joan Hunter Dunn. And here it is in this nice, that's Betjeman's own typing of it with corrections, capital D on the Dunn and so on. They were great friends and mutual admirers, Betjeman and DayLewis. And there's an extraordinary generosity. Betjeman was extraordinarily generous anyway in his evaluation of other people. He says, I mean, he's a much clearly better known figure in the end, but as a poet. But he says to DayLewis in the letter, having read some of his most recent book, he says, you're a serious poet. You're writing poems about serious things. Mine are just kind of echoey noises, my poems, which I think nobody would, I think, agree with that view of Betjeman anymore. But, I mean, Betjeman is a very, very sort of important poet. I was just looking recently at a review by Betjeman of the Welsh priest poet R.S. Thomas, reviewing his first book. And Betjeman, is a famous figure by this point, and Thomas is just an obscure Welsh clergyman. But he begins the review by saying, "This book will be famous long after the writer of this review is forgotten." And neither of them is forgotten, but it's typical of Betjeman's sort of generosity, which I think he shares with DayLewis. This is DayLewis's headstone in the churchyard in Dorset, next door to Thomas Hardy. He wanted to be buried near Hardy and was, it says C. DayLewis, poet laureate, which he was as well. I mean, he was, as I say, he succeeded Masefield and preceded Betjeman. But he ends, I think, again, over modestly, a bit like Betjeman, by saying, Poet Laureate, shall I be gone long, forever and a day, to whom there belong? Ask the stone to say, ask my song. I suppose there's a certain sort of claim in Ask My Song. He thinks that the poem is worth asking, really. Another strange link with Bowra is that Bowra was a rather controversial election as Oxford Professor of Poetry in 1951, I think. But he was immediately succeeded by DayLewis as Professor of Poetry, so it looked like a kind of closed shop, really. And towards the end of the exhibition, there are all these letters between Bowra and DayLewis, the original text, as well as with expert transcriptions of them by Tim. But they're very breezy, lively letters. He's a very good prose writer, DayLewis, both as critic and as sort of memoirist, really. And the letters kind of catch that, really. I suppose as Professor of Poetry, of course, he was a sort of major kind of figure. Auden, of course, also was Professor of Poetry, but he had all the major accolades really that were on offer, you know, as poet laureate and professor of poetry. Um, finally, he wrote detective. He's incredibly prolific. You know, he wrote a great deal. Detective novels as Nicholas Blake. Again, rather sort of ahead of his time, really. The part-time detective novel writer. This is the book called The Question of Proof, which is the first paperback edition of that in 1940, which is the year when he's also writing a memoir and his poems and doing kind of various sort of war service. But his reputation, I suppose, is thin spread, so to speak. I mean, there are so many places where he's prominent. He's not a specialist, but he's an all-rounder. You know, he's kind of good at everything, really. He was also famously and much commented on, famously good-looking as a kind of glamour figure. You know, and you can see that in the pictures. I mean, Autumn and Splendor and Ishmael would look okay, you know, but DayLewis is the glamour boy, like his son.